It was on a quiet July morning in 1948 that the world discovered the still body of Carole Landis, Hollywood's golden-haired enchantress, within the silence of her Pacific Palisades home. A note had been left upon the nightstand, the ink still fresh and the air heavy with a kind of sorrow that lingers long after footsteps depart. She was only 29 years of age, and though her beauty had once lit up screens and magazine covers, it was in this final stillness that her name was bound forever to whispers of tragedy. Before we begin, my friend, I welcome you into this circle of memory. I invite you to write in the comments where and when you are listening, for we are scattered across time and continents, yet joined in one thread of remembrance. If you wish to support this channel, kindly press the subscribe button so that our archive of stories may continue to grow. And now, let us step softly back into the long shadows of the past, into the years before fame, before scandal, before the silence of that July morning. She was born Frances Lillian Mary Ridsty on the 1st of January in the year 1919 in a small town called Fairchild, Wisconsin. The dawn of a new year brought with it her first breath, yet the place where she opened her eyes was far removed from the bright lights that one day would seek her. Fairchild was a modest settlement, wrapped in winters so deep that the snow seemed to swallow sound, and in summers so warm that the air smelled of cut grass and pine resin. In such a place, a newborn girl was but another fragile flame against the long night of poverty, for her family's life was one of constant labor and frayed hope. Her father, Alfred Ridsty, was a man unsettled, often restless, and her mother, Clara, struggled to keep their growing household together. Frances was the youngest of 5 children, and though she was loved, her arrival was perhaps not accompanied by great celebration, but by weary practicality. For mouths needed to be fed, and clothes mended, and days endured. It was said that Alfred's wandering spirit carried him away, and by the time Frances was still young, her parents' marriage had fractured. Such a wound in the family left its mark, not in the thunderous sound of quarrels, but in the quieter, enduring absence of a father who no longer returned each evening to his chair. In this absence, Clara became the anchor of the home. One can imagine the sound of her footsteps, steady and firm, as she moved through the small rooms, cooking, cleaning, and sewing, carrying with her the weight of survival. Perhaps the young Frances would watch her mother's hands, roughened by work, and begin to understand early that the world was not a place that offered gifts freely, but demanded toil, persistence, and resilience. The winters of Wisconsin were harsh. Snow gathered against the windows, winds howled through the cracks of wood and plaster, and in such nights a child could lie awake listening to the train whistles in the distance. Those trains carried dreams, carried strangers, carried stories from cities far beyond the horizon, and in the heart of little Frances, such sounds may have planted the first restless seeds of departure. Have you ever wondered, as you listened to a sound that came from far away, what life beyond your borders might hold? Did she lie awake with such wonder, imagining a life larger than Fairchild could contain? Her school days were marked not by excellence in books, but by a spark of performance. She was vivacious, eager to be noticed, and quick with laughter. Her beauty was already remarked upon, even as a child, a kind of brightness that others recognized, but that she herself had not yet come to wield as power. For a girl in a small Midwestern town in the 1920s, such beauty was both blessing and burden, drawing admiration but also expectations. Was it a crown or a chain? The answer is never simple. The Great Depression cast its long shadow during her girlhood. Jobs grew scarce, breadlines appeared in towns, and the dreams of many shrank to the simple hope of food on the table. For Clara and her children, survival meant work of any kind, and Frances took on small jobs where she could. Yet within her still burned a spark, not content to be hidden. She wanted the world, or at least the chance to see it. And so, with the unyielding courage of youth, she began to dream not of settling into the same rhythm her mother had endured, but of leaving. There is a story told more than once that even as a young teenager she spoke of Hollywood, of lights and cameras and fame. Imagine the laughter of others when such words were spoken in Fairchild. Hollywood was not only far away in miles, but also impossibly distant in class and opportunity. And yet, many a dream that once seemed absurd has later remade the world. Did she already know that the boundaries of her life could be stretched beyond recognition? Or did she cling to the dream as one clings to a candle flame in the night? Her family later moved to San Bernardino, California, in search of work and a better life. The climate changed, the mountains loomed, and the air was filled with dust and citrus. Here, Frances found herself closer to the world she sought, though still on the margins. She attended schools there, but was restless, impatient, drawn not to the stability of classrooms, but to the stage, the dance, the chance to be seen. She began performing locally, sometimes singing, sometimes dancing, her youthful figure and blonde hair already making her stand out. She was bold, perhaps even reckless, but such recklessness was often the only way forward for those who had nothing else to trade but their beauty and courage. Each performance was a step away from obscurity, a small stone laid upon the path that would one day carry her to the screens of the world. And yet, behind every such step was also uncertainty. The stage lights may have glowed warm upon her skin, but outside the halls the night was often cold, and the future remained uncertain. Her mother's struggles were not far behind her, and the memory of poverty was never fully erased. To seek a life in performance was to gamble, and gambling meant the risk of losing everything. But youth is often blind to such risks, or perhaps fearless of them. One imagines the girl at the edge of the stage after a performance, sweat still on her brow, hearing the applause fade. She stands there, half in shadow, half in light, with a question pressing at her heart. Will this applause ever grow louder, or will it vanish, leaving her once more in silence? It is here, at this threshold between girlhood and the pursuit of stardom, that we leave her for now. She stands in the dusky light of California evenings, her gaze lifted beyond the rooftops as the trains in the distance echo still, carrying dreams of elsewhere. The trains had passed, their whistles fading into the quiet of the night, and in that fading the sound of another rhythm remained, the steady, weary footsteps of her mother, Clara, moving about the home. Those footsteps carried the weight of abandonment, for Frances's father had long since drifted away, leaving behind the hollow echo of absence that never fully closed. It was not the thunder of arguments or the crashing of doors that lingered most in memory, but rather the soft yet unending sound of one woman forced to keep walking, to keep working, to keep carrying. For a child, such footsteps could be both comfort and sorrow, a reminder of survival and of loss all at once. Abandonment is not a single act. It is a wound that stretches across years. To watch her mother bear the load alone must have impressed upon Frances the sharp truth that men could vanish and promises could dissolve. Some say this shaped her restless pursuit of affection later in life, her search for bonds that could not be broken, though time and again they would break. One can almost see her as a little girl standing in a doorway, watching Clara mend a hem by lamplight, the lines of exhaustion on her face, the silence of a man's absence filling the room more fully than any presence ever could. Did she think then that love would always be fleeting? Did she silently vow that her life would not be as heavy with loneliness as her mother's? Clara's labor was constant. She sewed, she cooked, she stretched every coin until it bent. Her children helped where they could, but survival remained fragile, like a thin rope worn down by too much strain. Frances, though the youngest, grew quickly into awareness. She understood that the world asked much of women who were left alone, and in this understanding was planted the determination that would drive her, sometimes to glory, sometimes to despair. For determination is a double-edged gift. It lifts one into the light, but it also compels one onward, even when rest might be kinder. At school, she was not the scholar who excelled in books and sums, but she was lively, spirited, and quick with charm. Teachers may have sighed at her lack of focus, but her peers noticed the sparkle of her presence. There was already in her a hunger to be seen, a yearning not to be overlooked. Perhaps it was the absence of a father's gaze that left her so keenly aware of the need for attention. Or perhaps it was simply her nature, a spirit born restless, unwilling to fade into the background of a small town. But with charm came also vulnerability. The world was quick to notice her beauty, and quick also to impose upon it expectations that no girl could bear easily. Compliments carried hidden demands. Admiration became pressure. Was she already beginning to sense that her value in the eyes of others would always be tied to her face, her figure, the glimmer of her smile? It is a question that lingers, for the answer shaped so much of the life to come. The Great Depression deepened as she grew. Work became scarce, hopes thinned. Families across the Midwest bent under the weight of hunger and uncertainty. In Fairchild, even the land seemed to sigh with hardship. Fields lay fallow, shops closed, and the trains that passed carried not only passengers but also the dreams of escape. Clara's footsteps grew heavier, yet she did not falter. She was, in her own quiet way, unbreakable, though her unbreakable spirit left little time for gentleness. Frances must have learned early that the world gave little softness, and if one wanted tenderness, one had to seek it elsewhere. Perhaps in the glow of a movie screen, perhaps in the imagined embrace of a future that seemed impossibly far away. Her brothers and sisters shouldered their own burdens, and the house was filled not with abundance, but with necessity. Frances worked odd jobs, helping where she could, though always with that far-off look, as if her gaze stretched beyond the town limits. She had begun to discover the magic of the cinema, slipping into theaters where flickering images danced across silver screens. There she found worlds of elegance and romance, of laughter and song, where women were adored and men never disappeared into silence. For a girl whose life was marked by absence and struggle, such visions were intoxicating. Did she already sense that her destiny was tied to that world of shadows and light? There is a delicate cruelty in the way dreams take root. They begin as comfort, a private refuge from hardship, but soon they become demands of their own, whispering that nothing less than escape will suffice. For Frances, the cinema became not only an escape, but also a challenge, a promise that somewhere beyond Fairchild lay a place where she could be seen, admired, adored. That promise would drive her westward, but here, in these early years, it was still only a whisper in the darkened theaters. And yet, even as she dreamed, reality pressed close. Her family's poverty, her mother's fatigue, her father's absence, these were the truths that shaped her. The contrast between the harshness of her daily life and the glamour on the screen was stark. Perhaps it was this very contrast that sharpened her hunger. For those who have known deprivation, abundance shines brighter. For those who have known abandonment, love seems more urgent. For those who have lived in silence, applause resounds more deeply. By the time she entered her teenage years, Frances had already begun to stand apart. Her beauty blossomed, undeniable, attracting attention from boys and men alike. But attention is not love, and admiration is not security. She must have felt this, even as she relished the glances cast her way. The footsteps of her mother, always moving, always laboring, remained a reminder that a woman's life could be consumed by survival. Frances longed for more, for a stage, for an escape. And so, as adolescence edged into adulthood, She began to prepare herself for departure. The trains that had once been distant sounds would soon carry her dreams further. She would leave behind the footsteps of Clara and the echoes of Alfred's absence, carrying within her both the resilience of poverty and the hunger for something grander. But before that departure, she remained for a time in the small world of Fairchild and San Bernardino, balancing between the heaviness of reality and the shimmering allure of imagined futures. The footsteps of her mother still echoed in her mind, each step a reminder of both endurance and loss. And as the sound of those footsteps faded into memory, another sound began to rise in her life, the steady clicking of a film projector, casting shimmering light into darkened rooms. The shimmer of the projector light filled the small room, dust motes drifting lazily in the beam, as if carried from another world. For Frances, soon to be Carole, these flickering shadows became more than entertainment. They were windows into distant realms where lives glowed brighter, where women's laughter sparkled like champagne, and where men's adoration seemed unwavering and eternal. The hum of the machine, the occasional cough in the theater, the collective hush of an audience leaning into a dream, all of it became part of her awakening. Each visit to the cinema was not merely a pastime, but a lesson in possibility. She was still only a girl, seated among townsfolk weary from labor, yet she sat differently, as though she were not merely watching, but absorbing, learning, rehearsing. On the screen, she saw women who commanded attention with the tilt of a head, the arch of an eyebrow, the sway of a dress. She studied them quietly, as if preparing herself for a role that life had not yet offered, but that she already believed would come. Did she sense even then that the screen was not only a stage, but also a mirror, reflecting her future back to her in flickering silver light? The images promised a world far removed from the narrow streets and heavy silences of home. In those darkened halls, the absence of her father, the weariness of her mother, the endless labor of survival, all seemed to dissolve. She was carried into grand ballrooms, bustling cities, exotic landscapes, and perhaps the most intoxicating promise was not merely the escape, but the transformation. On screen, ordinary women could become extraordinary. It was not where you were born that mattered, but how you could appear, how you could perform, how you could be seen. For a girl from Fairchild, this was not just entertainment, it was revelation. Outside the theater, life remained unyielding. She still worked, still felt the limits of poverty pressing close. But with each film she watched, each actress she studied, the fire within her grew. Beauty was her gift, and she began to understand that it could be her passage as well. She dressed with more care, carried herself with a little more poise, practiced her smile in the mirror. She was rehearsing, always rehearsing, not only for roles but for a life that she believed awaited her beyond the horizon. The projector light became, in a way, a companion. It whispered to her that she was not bound by the footsteps of Clara or the absence of Alfred. It told her that the world was vast and that within its vastness there were places where she could shine, where applause would replace silence, where recognition would heal abandonment. Yet there was also danger in such whispers. For while the cinema offered dreams, it did not offer instructions on how to reach them. The path from Fairchild to Hollywood was not a path marked by signs, but by risks, by leaps, by relentless determination. And determination alone does not promise safety. As she grew, her fascination with film became less secret, more bold. She spoke openly of her desire to be an actress, to live under the lights she so admired. Some must have laughed. Others perhaps dismissed her words as youthful fancy. But within her, the decision was already taking form. She would not be contained by obscurity. She would not remain a spectator forever. She would step through the screen, into the light. When the family moved to California, the distance between dream and reality narrowed. The smell of citrus groves, the dry wind across the mountains, the wider streets of San Bernardino, All of these became the backdrop for her restless ambition. Here she was, nearer to Los Angeles, nearer to the studios where the very films she adored were made. Yet even in proximity, the dream remained immense. To bridge the gap between a small-town girl and a starlet required more than hope. It demanded sacrifice, resilience, and a willingness to risk everything. And so she began to perform in local shows, to dance, to sing, to place herself before audiences, however small. Each performance was a rehearsal for the greater stage she believed awaited her. Her beauty caught eyes, her charm drew applause, and though the pay was little, the taste of admiration was priceless. In these small, dimly lit halls, she practiced not only her art, but her courage, standing before strangers, offering herself to their judgment, and finding in their applause the affirmation that she belonged in the light. It was during these years that she began to take on jobs as a waitress, a dancer, a model. She learned quickly that beauty opened doors, but also that it invited dangers. Men noticed her, sometimes with kindness, sometimes with presumption. She walked a narrow path between opportunity and exploitation. Yet she pressed forward, for to stop was to accept obscurity, and obscurity was the one fate she would not endure. The projector light still shimmered in her memory. Each time she passed a theater, each time she saw a poster, she was reminded of her vow. It was not enough to watch others live those lives. She must claim such a life for herself. The cinema had promised transformation, and she believed that promise with all the fervor of youth. And so, Frances began to transform herself. She styled her hair, adjusted her walk, refined her voice. She was becoming someone new, someone who might belong to the world she dreamed of. Her birth name, heavy with the weight of ordinary life, would one day be shed, replaced with a name that glowed. But for now, she was still Frances, sitting in darkened theaters, letting the projector light wash over her, each flicker another step away from the world of footsteps and absence, another step toward a destiny shimmering just beyond reach. Yet the projector, though bright, could not banish every shadow, for as she dreamed, she must have felt also the ache of uncertainty. How many girls had sat in those same theaters, dreaming the same dreams, only to remain forever unseen? How many promises had the screen whispered that would never come true? Did she ever doubt, even for a moment, that her dream was possible? Or did her hunger leave no room for doubt, driving her forward no matter the risk? These questions linger, as they must, but what is certain is that the projector's light did not fade in her. It remained, glowing within her, urging her onward. And as the applause of small halls echoed in her memory, she turned her eyes westward still toward Hollywood, where cameras clicked and names glowed on marquees. And it is there, in the snapping sound of studio cameras, that her story moves next. The snapping of studio cameras was not yet her own, not yet fixed upon her face, but in the restless sound of that imagined future, she began to move with determination. The shimmer of the projector had become too small, too confined to the darkness of local theaters. Frances, soon to cast off the weight of her given name, stepped boldly into the wider world, carrying with her only youth, beauty, and a courage that bordered on defiance. Yet before the glow of cameras could embrace her, there were years of toil, and the clatter of diner dishes often filled her ears more than the applause of any stage. She found herself in California, closer to the golden hills of Los Angeles, but still on the edges of survival. Work was needed, money scarce, and so she became a waitress, balancing trays, enduring the brusque words of hurried customers, her smile forced but practiced. The smell of coffee and frying bacon clung to her clothes, and the endless rhythm of clinking glasses and dropped spoons seemed at times a cruel soundtrack to a dream that felt so far away. Yet even here, in these unremarkable moments, she was studying, rehearsing, perfecting her presence. Each customer was an audience. Each smile was a performance. But she did not remain in diners alone. She danced in clubs. She modeled. She sought every small stage upon which she could be seen. At times the lights were dim, the pay little more than coins, but the act of standing before strangers and commanding their eyes was what mattered most. The girl from Fairchild was becoming someone else, someone brighter, bolder. The reckless courage of youth drove her into places that might have daunted others. She had nothing to lose, and so she risked everything. The move westward was not only a change of place, but a transformation of identity. She was no longer merely Frances Ridsty, daughter of Clara, abandoned by Alfred. She was sculpting herself into something new. Her body, her voice, her manner, all became tools of reinvention. The camera, she believed, would one day love her, and so she prepared herself to love it first, to offer it everything she could. Yet the path was neither smooth nor certain. Hollywood was crowded with hopeful faces, each one beautiful, each one determined. To be noticed required not only talent but audacity, and audacity she possessed. She approached casting calls with the same fearless energy that had once carried her onto local stages. If doors closed, she knocked again. If smiles were ignored, she smiled wider. It was said of her later that she was tireless in pursuit, unwilling to accept obscurity, unwilling to fade. This trait, born of poverty and sharpened by hunger, would be her strength, and sometimes also her undoing. But in these early years, that strength carried her forward. She managed to gain small roles, fleeting appearances in films where her name was not yet listed, where her presence was little more than a passing shadow in the background. For many, such obscurity would discourage, but for her it was proof that the door had opened, however slightly. She was inside now, however briefly, and that meant she could push further. Outside of the studios, she still returned to waitressing, to dancing, to the endless jobs that sustained her body while her spirit reached for the screen. The clatter of dishes was the rhythm of survival. But in her mind, she always heard the snapping of cameras, the imagined applause of audiences yet to know her name. She walked the streets of Los Angeles with her head high, as if rehearsing for a fame she believed inevitable. And yet, beneath this boldness, one can imagine the quiet nights of doubt, the rented rooms, the loneliness, the moments when money ran thin and promises of opportunity dissolved into nothing. Did she sit at night and wonder if she would ever be more than a waitress with dreams too large for her station? Did she cry quietly into pillows, careful not to smudge the face she so carefully prepared each morning? Dreams, no matter how fierce, are heavy things to carry, especially when the world shows little sign of delivering them. But she did not surrender. Her ambition was not a fleeting whim, but a fire. She pressed forward through rejection, through poverty, through fatigue. Each small part, each photograph taken, each audition endured was another stone on the path she was laying before herself. The clatter of diners faded slowly into the snapping of cameras until the two sounds seemed almost entwined, the noise of survival blending with the promise of glory. And there was something more. She began to believe in the power of reinvention, not merely as strategy, but as necessity. To remain Frances was to remain tethered to the weight of her past, the footsteps of Clara, the absence of Alfred, the narrow streets of Fairchild. To become someone new was to claim freedom. She began to shape not only her body and her charm, but her very identity. A new name waited ahead, one that would glow on marquees, one that would allow her to step fully into the light. But before that moment, she remained in this fragile space, half dreamer, half survivor, walking between diners and studios, her beauty catching glances, her ambition driving her forward. The girl who once sat in darkened theaters watching others had now entered the same world, if only on its edges. The dream was no longer distant. It was near enough to touch, though still capable of slipping away. And so she continued, clattering dishes in her ears, cameras snapping in her mind, rehearsing for the life she knew must come. The stage was set, the transformation already underway. The snapping of cameras lingers still, fading now into the glittering letters of a marquee, her new name flashing half-lit against the night. The half-lit marquee flickered in the night, her new name not yet fully aglow, but shimmering enough to suggest what was to come. Frances Ridsty was falling away like a garment shed at the threshold of a new life, and in her place arose the name Carole Landis. It was chosen with care, borrowed partly in homage to Carole Lombard, who already glistened as one of Hollywood's brightest comets, and paired with Landis, a name that carried a certain sharpness and strength. Names are more than labels. They are vessels, masks, invitations to be seen differently. With this choice, she declared that she was no longer merely a waitress, a dancer, or a hopeful girl from Wisconsin. She was to be a star, even if the world did not yet know it. And yet the marquee was only half lit. The studios still saw her as another pretty face, another blonde among dozens, to be used in fleeting glimpses rather than trusted with stories of her own. She appeared in films, yes, but uncredited, anonymous. The camera captured her smile, her figure, her sparkle, but not her name. To be seen without being named is to exist in a shadow. For many, it was enough simply to stand beneath the lights, to be captured even for a moment. But for Carole, anonymity was unbearable. Each time her face passed unnoticed in the background, she felt not triumph, but frustration. For what use was beauty? What use was determination if it left no mark? She fought to be noticed. Publicity was the weapon, and she wielded it without hesitation. Photographs circulated of her on beaches, in clubs, her hair gleaming in the California sun, her figure striking poses meant to catch the eye. The press began to whisper about her, to call her the most beautiful girl in Hollywood without a role. Such a title was cruel in its truth, but it was also a form of recognition, and she understood that recognition, however slight, was a step toward the glow she sought. She courted it, fed it, turned it to her advantage. In the harsh glare of a competitive industry, she learned early that beauty alone was not enough. One must demand to be seen, even if it meant playing into the very gaze that confined her. But in the shadows of these early years, there was also doubt. At night, away from the cameras, did she ever fear that she might remain forever on the margins? Did she wonder whether her new name, so carefully chosen, would ever truly shine upon the screens she had once watched in awe? The half-lit marquee hung above her, glowing just enough to remind her of what might come, but always threatening to flicker out. Still, she pressed forward. Her persistence caught the attention of those within the studios, and slowly the roles began to grow, though still small, still tentative. She moved across sets where great stars commanded attention, and she absorbed everything she could, watching, learning, imitating. She was not content simply to appear. She wished to understand how stars carried themselves, how they drew the gaze of the camera, how they commanded scenes. Each small role became a classroom, each fleeting moment on screen a lesson in the craft she sought to master. There is a paradox in these years. She was both seen and unseen, both shimmering and overlooked. For the audience, her beauty was undeniable, yet for the studio executives, she remained interchangeable, one among many. The distance between being admired and being valued was wide, and she stood precariously in the gap. This distance would haunt her always, for though she would rise to fame, she would also struggle to prove that her worth extended beyond the curve of her smile or the gleam of her hair. The marquee flickered on, and the letters of her new name grew steadier. Carole Landis, the studio began to declare, was a rising star. Her publicity machine worked tirelessly. She appeared in magazines, her photographs sold as pinups, her figure praised and circulated among soldiers and fans. She was given the nickname the Ping Girl, a term that suggested energy, sparkle, vitality. But even this was a double-edged crown, for such nicknames reduced her to novelty, to a caricature of charm rather than a woman of depth and talent. She accepted it, for to refuse would have meant silence, but behind the acceptance, there must have been frustration. To be known yet misunderstood is a peculiar form of loneliness, and so she stood beneath the marquee, her name finally lit, yet not in the fullness she desired. She was famous for being beautiful, for being lively, for being glamorous, but not yet for her craft. The world watched her, admired her, but did not yet truly know her. Perhaps she knew this. Perhaps she wrestled with it in the quiet moments when the cameras were put away. Fame, she discovered, was not a single destination but a series of fragile steps, each one demanding new sacrifices, each one threatening to dissolve. And yet she could not turn back. The girl who once listened to trains in Fairchild was gone. The woman who now walked Hollywood streets with her head high was determined to claim the light, no matter how long it flickered. In the glow of that half-lit marquee, with her new name shimmering above her, she prepared herself for the role that would change everything, the role that would carry her out of the shadows and into the full glare of the public eye. It was not yet upon her, but she could feel it near, like the hush before the applause, like the flicker of a projector just before the image sharpens. And in that flicker, the sound of applause begins to rise, carrying us forward into her first great triumph. The applause swelled from the flicker of the screen as though the very light that once shimmered in her dreams had finally sharpened into form. It came with 1 million BC in 1940, the film that turned Carole Landis from a shadow among many into a figure cast brightly against the cave walls of Hollywood's imagination. She was clad in animal skins, her golden hair unbound, her body presented as both wild and wondrous. The story itself was simple, a prehistoric fantasy meant to dazzle with spectacle. But what audiences remembered most was her. The applause was real now, not merely imagined, and it seemed at last that her name might glow fully upon the marquee. She became overnight the embodiment of something both ancient and modern, the untamed beauty of a mythic past and the polished glamour of a Hollywood starlet. The posters displayed her figure prominently, her eyes fierce yet inviting, her posture both vulnerable and commanding. Audiences, particularly men, were captivated. She was no longer merely the most beautiful girl in Hollywood without a role. She was the role itself, the figure that defined the film. And yet, beneath the glow of such attention, one wonders how she felt. Did she rejoice at the recognition, or did she already sense the limitations of such a triumph? For in 1 million BC, her voice mattered little, her words nearly forgotten. She was celebrated less as an actress and more as a vision, a body, a promise. Beauty had indeed become her passage, as she once believed, but beauty was also a chain, binding her to expectations she had not chosen. To be praised so widely for one's appearance can feel like both elevation and confinement. The applause that echoed in theaters was not applause for her craft, not yet, but for the spectacle of her form. Still, she embraced it, for what else could she do? To reject such recognition would be to return to obscurity, and obscurity was her greatest fear. She smiled for the cameras, posed for endless photographs, and allowed the world to see in her what it wished. The studios, delighted by her sudden fame, promoted her tirelessly. Her image appeared everywhere, in magazines, on posters, in the hands of soldiers who would later carry her likeness into battle. She became not merely an actress, but a symbol, a fantasy. And yet, as she basked in the glow of this new fame, there must have been a quiet dissonance. Was this the stardom she had longed for, the applause she had heard in her mind as a child in Fairchild? Or was it a distorted echo, loud but hollow, leaving her still unseen in ways that mattered most? The projector had promised transformation, and indeed she had transformed. But the transformation was shaped by others, by studio executives, by photographers, by the gaze of strangers who cared little for the person behind the image. The paradox of beauty became her daily companion. It opened every door, yet it closed others. It brought her into the spotlight, yet it kept her from being recognized as more than an adornment. She was both adored and diminished, both elevated and silenced. This paradox would follow her throughout her life, feeding her ambition even as it wounded her spirit. For to be reduced to beauty alone is to be denied complexity, to be denied depth. Her name now glowed fully on marquees, her image sold across the nation, and still she longed for more. She wanted to be known not just as a figure of desire, but as an actress of skill, as a woman of substance. She wanted the applause to be for her voice, her choices, her craft. And so she continued to work, to study, to refine herself, even as the studios preferred her to remain what she already was. But audiences loved her, and that love could not be ignored. She was invited to more films, more roles, though many of them leaned heavily on her beauty. She was presented as the glamorous companion, the alluring distraction, the symbol of desire. Her attempts to find roles of greater depth were often thwarted by the very image that had made her famous. The studios knew what sold, and they were unwilling to risk altering the formula. For Carole, this meant both triumph and frustration. She was known, admired, adored, and yet still unseen. In her personal life, the paradox deepened. Men pursued her, drawn by the very beauty that the world celebrated. But often, they sought her as a fantasy rather than as a partner. She longed for love, for stability, for a devotion that would not vanish like her father's footsteps. Yet what she found instead were romances, as fleeting as the films in which she appeared. The applause of audiences could not replace the intimacy she craved, and the image she projected on screen seemed to overshadow her truest self. Still, she moved forward, ever determined, ever unwilling to surrender to despair. Each new role, each new photograph, each new whisper of admiration was fuel for her spirit. She was alive in the glow of the cameras, even if the glow sometimes blinded her to her own worth. The paradox of beauty was cruel, but she bore it with grace, with charm, with the same reckless courage that had once carried her out of Fairchild and into the uncertain light of Hollywood. And as the applause echoed, as the cameras clicked, there lingered always a shadow. The whispers in dressing rooms, the judgments of critics, the unspoken question of whether she would ever be known for more than her beauty. That question, like a soft murmur behind the roar of applause, accompanied her everywhere, unresolved, insistent. The applause fades now into that murmur, into the soft whispers of dressing rooms where stars prepared themselves not only for audiences, but also for survival. The whispers of the dressing rooms clung to her as persistently as the perfume in the air, curling around mirrors fogged with breath and dusted with powder. They were whispers of envy, of admiration, of gossip disguised as praise. And in their echo, Carole learned how quickly reputations were spun, how easily a single name could become an invention belonging to everyone but oneself. She was now Carole Landis, the Ping Girl, a studio-crafted title meant to capture her supposed sparkle and vitality. The words were light, playful, catchy, meant for soldiers to murmur with a grin, meant for reporters to scatter like confetti. But Carole knew, even as she smiled for the cameras, that such nicknames were another kind of mask, a shield that drew eyes while concealing her truest self. The studio publicity machines worked tirelessly, creating images of her lounging in swimsuits, smiling beside cocktails, dazzling in gowns that shimmered like water under bright lights. To the world, she was glamour itself, golden and untouchable. But glamour, when stripped of warmth, becomes a cage. She had long dreamed of being seen, but now she found herself forced to be seen only in one way. her humanity flattened into an idea. And behind the glitter lay the exhaustion of endless posing, endless smiling, endless rehearsals of perfection. Yet she played the part with care. She understood that this mask was also her crown. Soldiers carried her photographs across oceans, pinning them in tents, slipping them into pockets before battle. Young men admired her from afar, dreaming of her as an emblem of hope, a reminder of home. To them, she was not merely an actress, but a companion in absence, a shining presence against the darkness of war. How could she deny them that comfort? In the way her image traveled, she touched more lives than she could ever know. Perhaps in this knowledge she found some solace, some purpose within the hollow echo of glamour. Still, beneath the mask, her heart longed for depth. She practiced her craft, studied her lines, worked to prove she was more than a figure. But Hollywood is slow to allow women such freedom, and the studios were content to keep her in the roles that matched her beauty. Each time she hoped for a chance at complexity, she was steered again toward glamour, toward sparkle, toward the laughter that left no trace once the film ended. It must have been like reaching for a melody only to be handed a jingle. And so she turned her energy outward, to the world beyond the studios. During the war years, she threw herself into the work of entertaining troops, traveling overseas, visiting hospitals, performing for weary soldiers. Her laughter, her presence, her warmth, these became gifts she could give without the confinement of scripts or studio expectations. Among soldiers, she was not just the ping girl, but a living, breathing comfort. Someone who sang for them, who shook their hands, who reminded them of life beyond the battlefield. Perhaps it was here that she felt most herself, giving without pretense, meeting eyes that looked at her not as a commodity, but as a light. And yet, even here, paradox lingered. For while she poured herself into bringing joy to others, her own heart often felt empty, her own need for love unmet. She was adored by thousands, yet craved the devotion of one. The glamour that brought her so close to audiences left her isolated in private. To be loved as an image is not the same as being loved as a person, and this truth pressed upon her with each passing year. In the quiet of dressing rooms, as the whispers swirled, she must have felt the weight of that loneliness. Powdered mirrors reflect only surfaces, never souls. Lipstick, gowns, and laughter can create illusions, but when the lights are extinguished, the silence returns, and with it the ache of being unseen. Did she sit then with her hands folded, listening to the muffled applause fading beyond the walls, asking herself whether this was truly the life she had sought when she was a child in Fairchild? Still, she did not allow such questions to break her. The glamour mask was a crown, and she wore it gracefully, even when it pressed heavily upon her brow. She learned to navigate the whispers, to turn gossip into publicity, to transform caricature into presence. She was both queen and captive of her image, and she carried this duality with a poise that concealed her inner storms. The glamour shone outward, but inside she wrestled with its cost. She knew that applause built upon beauty could vanish with time, that the sparkle of Ping Girl could dull when youth faded. This knowledge made her hunger sharper, her determination more urgent. She sought to leave a mark that could outlast the ephemeral glow of publicity, to prove she was more than an invention of Hollywood's machine. And so the glamour, both mask and crown, became her constant companion, carried into every room, every performance, every whispered conversation. It clung to her like perfume, intoxicating to others, sometimes suffocating to herself. She wore it because she must, but in the shadows behind the lights, she longed to set it aside. The glamour mask glitters still, unresolved, shimmering in mirrors fogged with breath. And from that shimmer rises the sound of laughter, soldiers' laughter, weary but grateful, echoing across oceans, drawing her into her next role as a beacon in the darkness of war. The laughter of soldiers rose from the shimmer of glamour like a warm tide, carrying her far from Hollywood sound stages into the uncertain air of wartime. In tents lit by lanterns, in crowded canteens, on makeshift stages scattered across foreign soil, Carole Landis became more than an actress. She was a presence, a song, a face that reminded men of home, of wives and sweethearts, of a world untouched by gunfire. Her laughter mingled with theirs, her smile lifted their burdens for a moment, and in this service, she found a kind of fulfillment that Hollywood could not provide. The glamour mask still clung to her, yes, but here it seemed less a cage and more a gift, a brightness she could offer to others in their darkest hours. She traveled tirelessly, visiting England, Ireland, Africa, even as far as the South Pacific. Airplanes roared above, ships carried her across uncertain waters, and still she pressed forward. She entertained with song and conversation, she danced, she signed autographs, she held hands. In hospital wards, she bent low to speak gently to the wounded, offering words and warmth where medicine could not reach. Soldiers pinned her photographs near their bunks, her face a constant reminder that life was not only war. She was not alone in this work. Many stars gave their time, but there was something in her sincerity, her willingness to endure the same hardships that endeared her to those she met. The applause in these places was not like the applause of theaters. It was rougher, more heartfelt, erupting from throats parched by exhaustion, by longing. Men cheered not only for a performance, but for the simple joy of her presence. She had once dreamed of applause as the measure of stardom, yet here she discovered applause as communion, as gratitude. Did she feel in those moments that she was finally known, not merely as a figure on a screen, but as a woman who cared, who gave herself freely to strangers in need? Perhaps in their eyes she found a reflection of the love she had long sought. Yet even amid this warmth, shadows lingered. For as she gave tirelessly to others, she often returned to her own rooms in silence. The adoration of crowds is vast, but it cannot fill the quiet when one is alone. Letters were written, romances kindled and extinguished, but the tenderness she longed for remained elusive. She was adored by thousands, yet still she searched for the singular devotion that could anchor her restless heart. The soldiers' laughter was healing for them, but for her it may have deepened the ache of her solitude, reminding her that she could give comfort, but not always receive it. Her wartime efforts brought her recognition beyond the screen. She received commendations, was praised by military officials, and was remembered with affection by countless men who believed she had given them hope. Yet Hollywood, with its calculating gaze, often dismissed such devotion as a distraction, preferring to focus on the glamour, the image, the sparkle. Carole knew this. She knew that when she returned, the studio lights would again demand she play the part of the ping girl, the glamorous beauty, and that the sincerity of her service might fade into the background of gossip and publicity. Perhaps this knowledge made her even more determined to pour herself fully into the work while it lasted, to give everything she could while she was away from the sound stages. The war years etched themselves into her spirit. She had witnessed courage, pain, sacrifice. She had laughed with men who would never return, held hands with the wounded who clung to life. Such encounters deepen a soul, strip away illusion. Did she ever look at her own reflection afterward and see not merely an actress, but someone who had lived something larger, something heavier? The glamour remained, but now it carried with it a depth born of service, of shared humanity. And yet, when she returned to Hollywood, she found the same paradox awaiting her. The studios still saw her beauty first, her glamour foremost. They offered roles that mirrored her image rather than her experience. She longed to channel what she had seen, what she had felt, into parts of substance. But such chances were rare. Hollywood, ever hungry for novelty, began to turn its attention to new faces, new names. Though she was still admired, still desired, the glow was already shifting, and Carole must have felt the unease of time pressing against her. Fame, she was learning, is never secure. It flickers like the light of a projector, brilliant one moment, dimming the next. In her personal life, too, the war years left their mark. She had known brief romances, fleeting connections, but none held. Marriage had already entered and left her life more than once, each ending leaving her more restless, more uncertain. She had given so much of herself to strangers, yet the intimacy she desired remained beyond reach. Perhaps she began to fear that she would never find it, that the applause of the many would always be the substitute for the love of the one. Still, she carried herself with brightness. In photographs, she smiled as though untouched by doubt. In interviews, she spoke with charm and wit. But behind the brightness was a woman marked by the paradox of giving endlessly while receiving little in return. The glamour crown shone, but beneath it the heart grew weary. And so, when she walked once more into dressing rooms, when whispers rose again around powdered mirrors, she carried not only the glitter of the ping girl, but also the shadows of battlefields, the echoes of soldiers' laughter, the faces of men who had looked at her with gratitude instead of desire. These memories became part of her, deepening her even as Hollywood insisted on flattening her. She was no longer only the girl who dreamed of being seen. She was the woman who had been seen in ways she could never have imagined. The laughter of soldiers fades now into silence, into the heavy stillness of empty rooms. And within that silence comes the sound of a wedding march played softly, briefly, before dissolving again into quiet. For love and marriage in Carole's life were never simple melodies, but fragile songs that faltered before they could fully take shape. The wedding march, faint and hesitant, lingered only a moment before dissolving into the silence of rooms where flowers wilted too soon and promises withered before they could take root. For Carole Landis, love was never the steady flame she longed for, but a series of brief sparks, each one burning brightly before flickering out, leaving her in the half-dark once more. Her beauty, so luminous in the eyes of strangers, became both her invitation and her curse in romance. Men were drawn to her, captivated by the golden hair, the lively eyes, the laughter that seemed to pour sunlight into the air, and yet so often their devotion proved fleeting, their vows fragile. Her first marriage came when she was little more than a girl, 16 years old, impulsive, restless, eager to escape the narrow confines of her past. She wed Irving Wheeler in 1934, but the union was short-lived, annulled almost before it had begun. Youthful longing for independence, for escape, for a sense of being chosen, these may have guided her, but the reality of marriage was harsher than the dream. When the papers were signed and the vows undone, Carole carried within her a first lesson, that even love, even commitment could vanish, leaving her as abandoned as she had once felt in childhood. But she did not stop seeking. Her heart, restless and hungry, yearned for tenderness, for constancy. She entered marriages again, each time with hope renewed, as if the next would surely bring the permanence denied her before. In 1939, she married yacht broker Willis Hunt, a man of charm and sophistication, but within months their union, too, had unraveled. In 1940, she wed Thomas Wallace, a soldier who seemed to embody the stability she sought, yet this marriage, too, ended before a year had passed. Each departure deepened her wounds, but each beginning was taken up with fervor, for she could not live without hope. To surrender hope would have been to admit defeat, and Carole was not one to admit defeat easily. Her fourth marriage, to Air Force Captain Thomas Wallace, briefly seemed more promising, forged in the shadow of war, yet even it dissolved. Time and again she tried. Time and again she was left with silence where laughter should have been. By the time she had passed through these unions, her reputation began to be marked not only by glamour, but by whispers of instability, of a woman too restless, too demanding, too eager for love. Hollywood is quick to punish women for the very desires men are praised for, and Carole bore the weight of these whispers with quiet pain. And still, she sought love. Affairs began, passionate and secret, tangled in both joy and sorrow. Some lovers were famous, others less so. But what mattered to her was not their names, but the intimacy she craved, the promise, always the promise, that this time it might last. Yet so often the promises faltered, leaving her again in the silence of empty rooms, with the faint strains of wedding marches dissolving into echoes. Why did love escape her so persistently? Was it the men, dazzled by her beauty yet unprepared for the depth of her spirit? Was it her, too restless, too wounded by her father's abandonment, too hungry for devotion to accept anything less than complete? Or was it simply the cruel paradox of a woman whose public image was adored by thousands, but whose private self was seldom truly seen? The answers linger like unspoken questions, haunting every chapter of her life. The marriages, brief and broken, were not mere scandals to be whispered about in columns. They were chapters of longing, of hope rising and falling, of a woman searching for something she had glimpsed but never held. Each time she put on the gown, each time she signed the vows, she was not simply repeating a cycle, but daring again to believe that love could be hers. And each time she was left again with silence, the silence of empty halls, the silence of footsteps fading away. Hollywood, ever watchful, spun these private wounds into public stories. Her beauty, once her crown, became the weapon of her critics. She was painted as reckless, as unstable, as a woman who could not keep love. Yet behind these stories was a truer one, a woman who longed for what so many take for granted, who searched again and again for tenderness, who dared to hope even when hope seemed cruel. The faint strains of the wedding march fade now into the tapping of typewriter keys, for Hollywood's gossip columns were relentless, striking out stories that reduced her marriages to spectacle, her heartbreaks to scandal. The tapping grows louder, echoing like rain on tin, carrying us forward into the whispers of affairs and the judgments of a world eager to consume her sorrow as entertainment. The tapping of typewriter keys, sharp and unyielding, filled the silence left by wedding marches, their rhythm quick and merciless, like rain upon a metal roof. Reporters hunched over desks, their cigarettes burning low, their fingers striking headlines that turned her private heartaches into public spectacle. Affairs whispered in dressing rooms found their way into columns. Glances shared at parties were magnified into scandals. Carole Landis, once the hopeful girl from Fairchild and now the golden-haired starlet of Hollywood, discovered that her life was no longer entirely her own. Every romance became a rumor, every friendship a headline, every sorrow a story sold for others' amusement. The men she loved were often powerful, often famous, often bound already to others. In them she sought what she always had: affection, permanence, the warmth of being truly chosen. Yet to the public, such affairs were fodder for gossip, evidence of recklessness, of desperation. Her beauty, which had opened doors and brought her into the light, now made her an easy target. For in Hollywood, a beautiful woman's desires were never forgiven, while a man's indiscretions were easily excused. She bore the double weight of fame and femininity, her every step shadowed by judgment. Among these entanglements were names that carried weight, names that filled theaters and drew applause of their own. With each one came hope, the hope that perhaps here was the man who would not vanish, who would not break his vow. But again and again the pattern repeated, promises whispered, moments shared, and then the quiet unraveling. Some men could not risk their reputations. Others could not give what she sought, and still others saw her more as adornment than companion. Carole, who had given laughter to soldiers across oceans, who had poured herself into every role, found in private life only fragments of the devotion she longed for. The studios, meanwhile, exploited these whispers. Scandal was as marketable as Glamour, and so the publicity machine spun her affairs into stories meant to entice audiences. Her heartache was polished and sold like a trinket. And while her name remained on lips and pages, the cost was high. For every column that praised her beauty, another mocked her instability. For every photograph that captured her smile, another rumor painted her as restless, troubled, even tragic. The typewriter's tapping became not only the sound of her fame, but the sound of her undoing. Yet Carole was not one to hide. She walked boldly into parties, laughed loudly among friends, continued to dazzle at premieres. If she knew that whispers followed her, she carried herself as though unbothered, though perhaps inside the weight grew heavier. There is a strange strength in facing gossip with grace, in meeting the eyes of those who doubt you and smiling anyway. But even the strongest mask wears thin, and beneath it she must have felt the sting of every careless word, every headline that reduced her life to scandal. The affairs, the scandals, the rumors, all were woven into the tapestry of her story, yet none defined her completely. They were part of her search, her hunger for connection, her refusal to give up on love despite repeated wounds. Was she reckless, as the papers claimed? Or was she simply unwilling to surrender hope, unwilling to accept the silence that had haunted her since childhood? Perhaps she believed, with each new romance, that this time the promise would hold, that this time she would not be left behind. And is that not, in its own way, an act of courage? But Hollywood was cruel. It demanded perfection, punished vulnerability, and rewarded scandal only long enough to use it. For Carole, the constant storm of rumors eroded not only her reputation, but also her chances at roles of depth and dignity. Directors hesitated, producers whispered, and though she still worked, the parts offered were often shallow, built upon her image rather than her talent. She fought, as she always had, but the fight grew harder. Each new headline chipped away at the foundation she had built. The typewriter's clatter, relentless and impersonal, became the backdrop of her days. It was a sound she could not silence, a rhythm she could not escape. Her life, once her own, was now a story told by others, reshaped for the entertainment of strangers. Yet still she pressed forward, still she sought love, still she hoped for roles that might allow her to show the depth she carried within. And in the midst of this storm, there were friendships that shone, moments of genuine warmth amid the cold machinery of gossip. Friends who stood beside her, who saw her not as the ping girl or a headline, but as Carole, with her laughter, her generosity, her restless heart. Among these was Betty Grable, the radiant star who shared both glamour and burdens with her. Their companionship, though sometimes strained by the rivalries of the industry, offered Carole a reminder that she was not entirely alone. The tapping typewriter falls silent for a moment, as though out of respect, leaving only the sound of a champagne glass tipping, liquid spilling across a table. That shimmering spill becomes the doorway into the world of her friendships and betrayals, the fragile bonds that comforted her, even as they sometimes fractured beneath the weight of fame. The champagne glass tipped, crystal ringing faintly as liquid spilled across the polished surface, its golden stream gliding and dripping slowly over the edge. Laughter might have followed, or perhaps a hush, for in gatherings where glamour reigned, even the smallest accidents carried the weight of symbolism. For Carole Landis, friendships in Hollywood were often like that tipped glass, bright, effervescent, offering sweetness for a time, yet always in danger of spilling, of being lost, of leaving behind only stains and the memory of a fleeting sparkle. Among her closest companions was Betty Grable, America's wartime darling, whose face and figure adorned barracks walls across the globe. Betty and Carole shared more than the camera's gaze. They shared confidences, laughter, moments of loyalty in a city that devoured such things easily. They were often photographed together, radiant in gowns, smiling as though untouched by the sharpness of the world around them. Yet even within this bond there lingered shadows, the quiet tensions born of ambition, of comparison, of men whose affections strayed between them. Friendship in Hollywood was never simple, for the same light that illuminated one inevitably cast shadows upon the other. Carole valued loyalty fiercely, perhaps because life had offered her so little of it. She clung to friends with the same passion she clung to lovers, needing in them the stability she sought in vain elsewhere. With Betty, she found comfort, but also, at times, betrayal, or what felt like betrayal when affections shifted, when alliances faltered under the weight of gossip. Were they rivals? At moments, yes. But were they also sisters in a city that consumed women as quickly as it exalted them? Without question. Their bond was a fragile yet enduring one, reflecting the paradox of Hollywood itself, a place where affection and envy walked hand in hand, where laughter was genuine, even when trust wavered. Other friendships dotted Carole's life, with actors, with musicians, with those who shared her restless nights and bright mornings. She was generous, known to open her home to guests, to offer warmth and hospitality without hesitation. Friends remembered her laughter, her kindness, her ability to lift a room with her presence. Yet she was also vulnerable, trusting too deeply, believing too readily in promises that others could not keep. Her heart, so open in pursuit of love, was just as open in friendship, and that openness left her wounded more than once. The champagne glass spilling across the table becomes an image of this very openness, the willingness to pour oneself out, to risk being wasted, to give freely even when others do not handle the gift with care. Carole poured herself into relationships, into gatherings, into bonds that sometimes rewarded her with genuine affection and at other times left her emptied. Within these circles of laughter and chatter, there were betrayals that cut deeply. Men moved easily between women, friendships strained under the weight of divided loyalties, and gossip twisted even the kindest moments into something sharp. Carole, ever sensitive, felt these wounds acutely. For a woman who longed always for permanence, for devotion, even the shifting winds of friendship could feel like abandonment. And yet, she continued to reach out, to believe, to hope. To close herself off would have been safer, but it would have been against her nature. She was too alive, too generous to guard herself completely. Her friendships also reflected the loneliness that haunted her. In Hollywood, where true intimacy was rare, companionship offered moments of relief from isolation. Parties, dinners, long nights of conversation, they filled the void, even if only briefly. But when the laughter faded, when the guests departed, Carole was often left again in silence. The champagne glasses stood empty, the perfume of the evening dissipated, and the loneliness returned. Did she ever sit in those quiet hours and wonder if she was destined always to give more than she received? Did she question whether the laughter that surrounded her was a reflection of real affection or simply the echo of her own need to be loved? The fragility of her friendships mirrored the fragility of her career. Just as roles slipped away, just as studios turned their gaze to newer faces, so too did some companions drift, drawn by their own ambitions, their own needs. And yet, through it all, Carole continued to shine outwardly, to smile, to laugh, to charm. The mask of glamour remained, but beneath it the weight grew heavier, the strain greater. The image of the spilled champagne lingers, the golden liquid glistening on polished wood. It is a symbol of both abundance and loss, of moments bright yet fleeting. And from this image, another sound emerges, the slow extinguishing of a cigarette in an ashtray, the hiss of smoke rising into silence. It is the sound of evening's ending, of joy dissolving, of loneliness settling once more around her. The cigarette hissed faintly as it was pressed into the ashtray, smoke curling upward in a slow spiral before dissolving into the air. That final ember, glowing briefly before surrendering to ash, was a quiet reflection of what Carole Landis carried within her during these later years. For though she still sparkled in photographs, still laughed in public, still entertained friends with warmth and generosity, there were shadows gathering behind her eyes. Shadows she could not so easily banish with lipstick or gowns. The struggle was inward, silent, hidden behind the glitter that the world demanded of her. Depression is a word we speak more freely now, but in Carole's time it was cloaked in silence, misunderstood, even shamed. For a woman in Hollywood, especially one branded with glamour and beauty, such struggles could not be admitted openly. She was expected always to smile, to dazzle, to embody vitality. And so, when despair pressed heavily upon her, she masked it with laughter, with parties, with the charm that had become her armor. To the world she seemed radiant. To those closest to her, the cracks began to show. Illness, too, gnawed at her. She suffered from recurring physical ailments, exhaustion that drained her spirit, and fatigue that made even the simplest routines difficult. Yet she pressed forward, unwilling to let weakness be seen, unwilling to risk losing what fragile footing she had in the industry. In the mornings, she painted her face, styled her hair, and stepped into the world as though untouched, even when her body and spirit whispered otherwise. How heavy must such a mask have been, worn not for hours but for years? Friends noticed changes. There were moments when her laughter seemed forced, when her silences stretched longer than before. She withdrew at times, retreating into her home, her letters, her solitude. And yet, she continued to pour herself out for others. She visited hospitals, supported charities, entertained troops, gave freely of her time and energy. Perhaps she believed that by giving light she could ward off her own darkness. Or perhaps she simply could not bear to be alone with her thoughts, and so sought refuge in the company of others. Behind this struggle lay also the weight of her career. Hollywood, which had once embraced her with applause, was beginning to shift its gaze. New faces appeared, younger, fresher, ready to be crowned with the same glamour that had once been hers. Roles offered to Carole grew fewer, less significant. She fought for parts of substance, for opportunities that might reveal her depth, but too often the studios declined. They saw her as they had always seen her, beautiful, charming, but not serious, not enduring. To be dismissed in this way after years of work, after giving so much of herself, must have deepened the ache of invisibility. Depression thrives in silence, and Carole bore much of hers in silence indeed. She confided at times in letters, in private conversations, but in public, she was the same dazzling figure the world expected. How many evenings did she spend smiling through parties, her heart heavy beneath the laughter? How many photographs captured her glowing face while hiding her weary eyes? The dissonance between image and reality grew sharper, and within it her spirit wavered. It is said she sought help, that she visited doctors, that she attempted to manage her illness as best she could. But the treatments of her day were limited, the understanding shallow. Pills were prescribed, rest suggested, yet the deeper wound remained. For depression is not cured by cosmetics, nor by applause, nor by whispered reassurances that tomorrow will be better. It is a weight borne inwardly, invisible to most, visible only in the quiet moments when the mask slips. Carole's generosity never waned. She invited friends into her home, cooked meals, shared laughter. Yet afterward, when the glasses were emptied and the guests departed, the silence must have felt unbearable. The hiss of extinguished cigarettes, the smell of fading perfume, the quiet creak of an empty house, all became companions to her solitude. She had sought love so often, and though romances filled her life, permanence always eluded her. Each departure, Each broken promise left her more fragile, more uncertain. And the studios, once her great hope, offered little comfort. To them she was valuable only so long as her beauty sold tickets. The paradox deepened. She was adored yet alone, applauded yet overlooked, glamorous yet weary. Such contradictions erode even the strongest of spirits. And Carole, who had lived her life giving herself to others, audiences, soldiers, friends, found herself drained, her own needs unmet, her own heart aching. The cigarette ember glows faintly in the ashtray still, fading into nothing, leaving only a curl of smoke in the air. That smoke drifts upward, vanishing into shadows, carrying us into the emptiness of an unlit stage, where a lone spotlight searches for someone who is no longer there, a symbol of the roles denied, the opportunities lost, the dreams slipping further from reach. The lone spotlight swung across the empty stage, its beam searching like a restless eye, but no figure stepped into its circle. It was a symbol of roles withheld, of promises unkept, of the opportunities that slipped just beyond Carole's grasp. She had once believed the world of cinema would always embrace her, that her beauty and her presence would guarantee her place among the stars. Yet now, as years passed and new names rose with the swiftness of spring flowers, she found herself fighting to remain in the glow. Hollywood, ever fickle, had begun to turn its gaze elsewhere, and Carole, restless and determined, fought to draw it back. She sought every avenue to revive her career. She pursued auditions, met with producers, pressed her case with a determination born of desperation. She studied, trained, refined her craft, refusing to accept that she should be known only as a glamour figure. She wanted roles of depth, of meaning, roles that would prove her more than a pin-up or a pretty smile. Yet the studios, guided by profit and bound by habit, resisted. They remembered her as the Ping Girl, as the prehistoric beauty of 1 million BC, and they were unwilling to imagine her as anything else. For Hollywood, reinvention was rarely offered to women once they had been branded, and Carole bore the cruel weight of that truth. Still, she pressed forward. She accepted smaller roles, supporting parts, films that did not promise acclaim, but at least allowed her to remain within the industry's orbit. She traveled abroad, seeking opportunities in Britain, where audiences and directors sometimes viewed her with fresher eyes. She performed on stage as well as on screen, determined to prove her versatility. Each appearance was both a triumph and a reminder of what she had not yet achieved. She was applauded, yes, admired still, but the great roles eluded her, always slipping away like shadows at dusk. The struggle grew heavier with each year. Time, unyielding, pressed upon her. In an industry that worshipped youth, each passing birthday felt like a thief stealing chances from her. She was not yet old, not even 30s, but Hollywood's cruel arithmetic marked women harshly. The freshness that had once made her an overnight sensation was now compared to newer faces, younger starlets emerging from the same publicity machines that had once shaped her. Carole, who had fought so hard to escape obscurity, felt it creeping toward her again, not with the silence of poverty this time, but with the silence of neglect. The loneliness deepened. To be overlooked in love was one wound. To be overlooked in work was another. Combined, they pressed upon her spirit with merciless force. She wrote letters, confided in friends, revealing her fears, her exhaustion, her longing to be seen not only as beautiful, but as capable, as worthy. Yet letters cannot lift such weight, nor can kind words erase the sting of rejection. The empty spotlight loomed in her imagination, a constant reminder of what might have been, and still she persevered. There is something heroic and also tragic in her refusal to give up. She continued to dress elegantly, to attend gatherings, to present herself as though nothing had changed. In interviews, she spoke with charm, insisting on her gratitude, her determination. She would not let the world see her despair fully, for to admit defeat would have been to surrender the dream she had carried since childhood, but in private, the struggle wore her down. The mask grew heavier, the laughter more forced, the silence more consuming. There is a cruelty in time's passage when it meets ambition. For men in Hollywood, age could bring gravitas, deeper roles, greater respect. For women, it too often brought only dismissal. Carole knew this, felt it in the narrowing of offers, in the subtle shifts of attention at parties, in the way gossip columns spoke more of her romances than her work. She had lived her life for applause, for recognition, and now the applause grew fainter, the recognition more fleeting. Did she ever sit in the quiet of her home, remembering the days when audiences first applauded her in 1 million BC? Did she recall the faces of soldiers overseas, the warmth of their gratitude, the belief that she had given them hope? Did she wonder if those were the truest moments of her stardom, moments not bound by contracts or studios, but by genuine human connection? Such questions must have pressed upon her, for her career, once bright with promise, was now shadowed by doubt. The empty spotlight lingers still, its beam stretching across dust and silence. And from that silence, another sound emerges. The echo of a knocking upon a locked door, urgent yet unanswered, carrying us into the story of her final affair, her most heartbreaking hope, and the cruelty of promises that were never fulfilled. The knocking upon the locked door echoed through silence, urgent, insistent, unanswered. It is said that Carole Landis, in her final years, lived as though always standing before such a door, knocking upon it with hope that it might open into the love and permanence she craved. Behind that door was Rex Harrison, the acclaimed British actor whose voice and presence charmed audiences on stage and screen. For Carole, he became not merely another romance, but the possibility of salvation. The promise, perhaps, that this time the devotion she had sought all her life might finally be hers. Yet the door remained locked, the answers withheld, and the silence that followed would become one of the cruelest of her life. Their affair was both intoxicating and tormenting. Rex Harrison was married, yet his attentions toward Carole were unmistakable. He admired her beauty, enjoyed her company, and gave her the intimacy she longed for, but only within boundaries that suited him. For Carole, it was not enough. She believed in the possibility that he might leave his wife, that he might choose her wholly, that the love she gave so freely would at last be returned with permanence. Friends later said she spoke of marriage, of a future together, of her certainty that this was no fleeting passion but the true bond she had always sought. Yet Harrison, however affectionate, never offered what she needed most. The locked door became the symbol of this love. She knocked with devotion, with letters, with evenings spent waiting for his arrival, but always the barrier remained. He gave her attention but not commitment, affection but not promise. For a woman who had already endured abandonment, who had already felt the weight of loneliness despite fame, this half-love was a wound that deepened with each passing day. To be wanted but not chosen is a sorrow more cutting than rejection, for it offers glimpses of hope that wither again and again. Carole's friends noticed her despair. She grew thinner, quieter, more fragile. Her laughter, once so ready, seemed strained, her eyes shadowed. She confided her fears, her longing, her sense that time was slipping away. She had given herself so often, had believed so many promises, and now, with Rex, she clung to the hope that this would be different. But the silence behind the locked door persisted. Harrison, bound by his own life and unwilling to break from it, remained distant when she needed him most. Her depression, already heavy from career disappointments and loneliness, now deepened further. She wrote letters to friends, confessions of her struggle, pleas for understanding. She visited doctors, sought remedies, but none could touch the wound at her heart. For depression is not cured by pills alone when it is fed also by broken promises and unfulfilled longing. Her body grew weary, her spirit dimmed, and still she pressed forward, appearing at gatherings, smiling for photographs, playing her part beneath the glamour mask. But inside she was knocking still, always knocking, upon a door that would not open. The tragedy of her affair with Rex Harrison lies not only in the unbalanced devotion, but in the way it mirrored the pattern of her life. Again and again, Carole gave herself fully, recklessly, courageously to love, and again she was left with silence. Each departure, each broken vow echoed the absence of her father, the footsteps that faded when she was a child. The wound of abandonment, carried from youth into adulthood, was reopened with every disappointment. With Harrison, it was deepest of all, because she believed so strongly that he would stay. On nights when he did not come, the house must have felt unbearably empty. The ticking of clocks, the faint creak of furniture, the quiet rustle of curtains, all became reminders of absence. Did she sit with letters spread before her, rereading words he had written, searching for promises between the lines that were never truly there? Did she pace? Did she weep? Did she still hope even as despair pressed closer? Such questions linger unanswered, but in them lies the essence of her sorrow, that she could not stop believing even when belief became her undoing. The locked door still echoes, the knocking fading into silence, unanswered, and from that silence rises another sound, the soft shuffle of paper being folded on a nightstand, the weight of letters written in despair, the testimony of a heart that could no longer bear its loneliness. The paper folded on the nightstand carried the weight of more than words. It carried the final echoes of a life that had given itself too freely, too bravely, and too often without return. Ink pressed into the page with trembling hand, sentences shaped not to dazzle audiences nor charm friends, but to leave behind what her voice could no longer speak. These letters, written in her final days, bore the imprint of sorrow, of exhaustion, of a heart that had knocked for too long upon locked doors. They lay quietly beside her bed, a testament to her despair, waiting for eyes that would one day read them and wonder how such brightness could fade into such silence. Her final days were filled with a strange stillness, as though the outward performances had ceased and only the inward struggle remained. She had fought so long, for roles, for love, for recognition, and now the fight seemed to ebb away. Friends who visited noticed her fragility, the way her laughter no longer rose as easily, the heaviness in her eyes that even the finest cosmetics could not conceal. She was only 29, yet her spirit seemed aged by decades of longing and disappointment. The industry that had once celebrated her now barely remembered her. The lovers who had once sworn devotion had turned elsewhere, and within her own heart the shadow of depression, relentless and suffocating, grew too vast to endure. She spent time in her home, the Pacific Palisades residence that should have been a sanctuary, but had become instead a chamber of solitude. The rooms were filled with her possessions, with photographs and mementos, with the traces of a life lived in public light. Yet to her they may have felt like hollow reflections, reminders of what once was rather than what might still be. The ticking of clocks marked each hour, the sea breeze carried faint salt through open windows, but these details were only background to the weight of her thoughts. She was, in the truest sense, alone, even when surrounded by evidence of her fame. The letters on the nightstand bore witness to her final resolve. One was addressed to her mother, another to friends, and at least one to Rex Harrison, the man whose promises had remained forever uncertain. She poured into them what she could not say aloud, her gratitude, her sorrow, her despair. To some she asked forgiveness, to others she expressed love. There is in these letters not only despair but also tenderness, the mark of a woman who even in her final act thought of others more than herself. Perhaps she hoped her words might soften the blow of her departure, might carry her love into a future she would not see. On the morning of July the 5th, 1948, The silence in her home was profound. Carole Landis was found lifeless in her bedroom, the folded letters beside her, an empty vial nearby. She had taken her own life, unable to bear the weight of despair any longer. She was not yet 30, still radiant, still beautiful, still admired by many. But within her, the loneliness had triumphed. The locked door had remained shut, and the silence had claimed her. News of her death spread swiftly, carried by the same typewriters that had once turned her romances into scandal. Papers reported the tragedy with both sympathy and cruelty, some mourning her loss, others whispering of the circumstances, the affair, the unanswered questions. Rex Harrison himself was said to have been among those who discovered her, though even in this moment, controversy and rumor swirled. Was her death the result of heartbreak, of illness, of despair too long endured? The answers blurred into speculation, for the truth was buried with her. Only the letters remained, fragments of a voice silenced too soon. Her death struck with the shock of youth cut short, of beauty extinguished, of promise unrealized. Fans mourned, friends wept, yet Hollywood moved swiftly onward, as it always did. New stars rose, new headlines filled the pages, and Carole's name, once so luminous, began to fade into the background of memory. The tragedy of her passing was whispered for a time, but even tragedy grows quiet when the world is hungry for new stories. And yet, her death left questions unresolved. Did she hope her final letters would bring understanding? Or were they simply the last effort of a weary heart to leave behind some trace of itself? Did she believe anyone would read them with the tenderness she desired? Or was she already certain they would be consumed by the same machinery of gossip that had shaped her life? Did she imagine, in those final moments, that she might be remembered not only for her beauty, but also for her sorrow, her struggle, her humanity? The paper remains folded on the nightstand in memory, carrying words that echo still across decades. And from that folded paper rises the sound of a curtain being drawn, sunlight spilling into an empty room, for the world did not end with her silence. Outside, the sea continued to crash upon the shore. The gulls still cried overhead. The city still moved restlessly onward. Life carried on, indifferent, even as one star's light faded forever. The curtain was drawn and sunlight spilled across the empty room, touching the stillness with a cruel brightness. The bed where Carole Landis had lain in her final hours was suddenly illuminated, as though the day itself refused to respect her wish for silence. Outside the windows, the gulls circled. The ocean waves struck the shore with endless rhythm, indifferent to the tragedy within. And in that room, where folded papers rested upon a nightstand, where perfume still lingered faintly in the air, a life of glamour and longing had come to its end. Yet endings in Hollywood are seldom granted peace. Almost before the sunlight had fully warmed the floorboards, questions rose like shadows, whispers trailing beyond the walls, scattering across the city and into the world. News spread swiftly. The telephones rang, reporters hurried, typewriters once more clattered without pause. Carole Landis was gone at only 29, and already her death was woven into a story told by others. Some wrote with sympathy, recalling her beauty, her service to soldiers, her dazzling presence on screen. Others wrote with sharper edges, emphasizing scandal, pointing to the empty vial, to the unanswered door, to the name of Rex Harrison. Rumors swirled like smoke, thickening until the truth itself seemed hidden. Was her death born of heartbreak, of despair rooted in her career's decline, of illness, exhaustion, loneliness that no doctor could treat? The answers, delicate and complex, were lost in the rush of speculation. Rex Harrison's name appeared again and again, his presence in her life now magnified by tragedy. It was said he had found her, or that he was among the first to arrive, that he read her final words, that he carried with him the guilt of doors unopened and promises unfulfilled. Yet the truth remained clouded. Did he ever intend to leave his wife, to choose Carole fully, or was his affection always bounded by his circumstances? Did he love her as she had loved him? The silence of her letters could not be broken, and Harrison himself, though he mourned, never clarified the uncertainties that swirled around them both. The locked door remained locked. Even in death, friends and admirers mourned. Betty Grable wept openly, remembering the laughter they had shared, the sisterhood they had found in fleeting moments of ease. Soldiers who had once pinned her photographs to tents now grieved quietly, recalling the woman who had brought them hope across oceans. To them, she had been more than glamour. She had been warmth, kindness, light. And yet, even in mourning, the narrative of scandal persisted. For Hollywood has always been more comfortable with spectacle than sincerity, more eager to sell stories than to preserve dignity. Carole, even in death, was not freed from being an image. The funeral drew both solemnity and whispers. Crowds gathered, some with genuine grief, others with curiosity. Flowers covered her casket, their fragrance heavy in the summer air, mingling with the salt of tears and the murmur of gossip. She was laid to rest, but rest was a word the world did not allow her. Her beauty, her tragedy, her final act, all were retold, reshaped, reimagined, until she was less a woman remembered than a symbol consumed. And yet, beneath the noise, there remained the undeniable stillness of loss. A mother grieved her daughter, siblings mourned their sister, friends felt the emptiness of her absence. The sunlight that had spilled into her empty room continued to shine elsewhere, but in the lives of those who had loved her truly, a shadow lingered. For Carole Landis was not only a figure of glamour, she was a woman of laughter, of generosity, of restless hope. Those who knew her well remembered her for these qualities, even as the world at large remembered her for scandal and tragedy. Her death left behind unanswered questions that remain even now. Could she have been saved if Hollywood had offered her more? If lovers had chosen her more fully? If friends had recognized the depth of her despair? Or was her fate written long before, in the footsteps of her father's departure, in the silence of abandonment that shadowed her from childhood? Was she destined always to seek permanence where none could be found, to long for a devotion that life withheld? These questions are unanswerable, and yet they linger, like sunlight in an empty room, like waves repeating their endless rhythm upon the shore. The image of her final mourning became fixed in memory. The folded letters, the drawn curtain, the sudden burst of sunlight upon stillness. And from that sunlight rises the rustling of newspapers in the wind, carrying her story outward, spreading across the city and beyond, reshaped with every telling, transformed into rumor, myth, and memory. The newspapers rustled in the wind, their pages flapping like restless wings, carrying her story from the streets of Los Angeles to distant towns where readers scanned the headlines over their morning coffee. The ink was barely dry, and yet already her life was being reshaped into something she might not have recognized. Carole Landis, dead at 29, was no longer the hopeful girl who had once gazed at projectors in Fairchild, nor the tireless entertainer of soldiers, nor even the woman who had fought so fiercely to be taken seriously as an actress. To the papers, she was a tragedy, a scandal, a starlet consumed by heartbreak. Words were chosen not to honor, but to sell, and in those pages her life became as much rumor as memory. Some stories dwelled on the details of her death, lingering on the empty vial, the letters, the scene discovered in her Pacific Palisades home. Others emphasized her love affair with Rex Harrison, suggesting betrayal, unfulfilled promises, secret tensions. Still others framed her passing as inevitable, as though her beauty and ambition had destined her for a tragic end. In these narratives, nuance disappeared, and Carole was made into an emblem of Hollywood's cruelty, of fleeting fame, of the perils of desire. But was she not also a woman of laughter, of generosity, of courage? Did the newspapers forget that she had crossed oceans to bring joy to soldiers in war, that she had once lifted spirits in hospital wards with nothing more than a smile and a kind word? Or was it easier to remember her for scandal, for sorrow, for the silence of her final morning? The rustling of newspapers carried these questions, but offered no answers. For the world is always drawn more to the dramatic than the tender, more to the sensational than the sincere. Her fans mourned her sincerely, writing letters, sending flowers, keeping her photographs close. But the larger narrative was shaped by the press, and the press saw her not as Carole, but as Hollywood's forgotten star, a phrase that would haunt her legacy. Forgotten, and yet never truly gone, for to be forgotten in Hollywood is to be remembered only in fragments, in whispers, in the margins of history. Friends defended her, speaking of her kindness, her humor, her tireless energy. Betty Grable, heartbroken, reminded the world that Carole had been more than the headlines suggested, that she had been a loyal friend, a woman of spirit. Soldiers who had once cheered her wrote of her compassion, her willingness to spend hours among them, her refusal to treat them as anything less than equals. These voices tried to correct the story, to remind others of the fullness of her life, but their words were drowned by the louder clamor of rumor. For scandal sells more readily than sincerity, and the rustling of newspapers favored scandal. Her death also gave rise to speculation that would never be silenced. Some wondered whether Rex Harrison had promised more than he gave, whether his rejection in her final hours had tipped her into despair. Others questioned whether Hollywood's neglect had broken her spirit, whether the decline of her career had eroded the foundation of her hope. Still others suggested deeper illnesses, struggles unseen, battles of mind and body that were never fully recognized in her time. Each theory carried a fragment of truth, but none could capture the whole, for the truth of a life cannot be reduced to a single cause, a single moment, a single act. And so Carole Landis became, in death, a mystery as much as she had been a woman. Her beauty was remembered, her tragedy emphasized, her complexity lost. She was cast once more into the role she had always resisted, a symbol rather than a person, a story rather than a soul. Perhaps this was the cruelest fate of all, not only to die young, but to be remembered not for who she was, but for what others imagined her to be. The newspapers rustled still, carried on breezes through streets and alleys, their ink fading in the sun. And as they drifted into silence, another image emerged, a broken marquee, its letters flickering, only one still glowing faintly against the night. That solitary letter becomes the symbol of her fading presence, the way memory dims when no one looks upward, when stars are left to burn unseen. The broken marquee flickered in the night, its once bright letters now dimmed, only a single bulb glowing faintly, as though reluctant to surrender entirely to darkness. So too did the memory of Carole Landis begin to fade after her passing, lingering in fragments, in photographs tucked away, in whispers shared by those who had once adored her. Hollywood, ever restless, moved on quickly as it always had, its machinery forever hungry for new faces, new names, new scandals. The studios that had once splashed her image across posters now barely spoke her name, and in the rush of premieres and headlines, her story was pushed to the margins. Yet even as the world hurried forward, her presence did not vanish completely. Like the faint glow of that last bulb, she remained, half-remembered, haunting the edges of memory. Fans who had pinned her photographs to their walls or carried them across seas did not forget so easily. For them, she was still the radiant face who had smiled from magazines, the kind voice that had cheered them in hospitals and camps. Letters arrived at papers, at studios, at her family's home, mourning her loss, recounting moments when her presence had offered comfort. These remembrances were tender, sincere, untainted by scandal, but they were small voices compared to the larger clamor of Hollywood, where new idols rose swiftly, eclipsing those who had fallen. Carole's memory survived not in the glare of cinema, but in the quiet devotion of individuals who refused to let her be erased. And yet the silence grew. Her films were seldom revisited, her roles overshadowed by stars whose careers endured longer. Her nickname, once a badge of publicity, the Ping Girl, lost its sparkle and became instead a curious relic of another era, a phrase remembered by few. For a woman who had lived her life yearning to be seen, who had fought to escape obscurity, this fading must have seemed the cruelest irony. Even in death, the applause she had once dreamed of dwindled into silence. Still, memory is never entirely lost. Photographs endured. Carole in swimsuits on beaches, Carole in gowns at premieres, Carole smiling as though the world could never touch her. Each image became a portal into her life, a way for later generations to rediscover her, to wonder at her beauty, to ask what sorrow lay behind her eyes. The broken marquee may have dimmed, but its faint glow continued to draw the curious, the sympathetic, those drawn to stories of forgotten stars. Her friends remembered her too, though even their voices grew quieter as years passed. Betty Grable spoke of her with affection, recalling her warmth, her generosity, her laughter. Others who had known her personally carried her memory like a secret flame, one they lit privately in conversations, in recollections, long after the world had ceased to care. These memories preserved not only her glamour, but her kindness, her sincerity, her humanity. For those who had known her truly, Carole was never only scandal or tragedy. She was a woman of depth, who had given more than she received, who had loved more than she was loved. And yet time pressed on. Decades passed, and Carole Landis became less a name remembered than a footnote in books on Hollywood's golden age. Scholars and enthusiasts sometimes rediscovered her story, noting her beauty, her early rise, her tragic end. But for the wider world, she remained half forgotten, her light obscured by stars whose flames had burned longer. Perhaps this too is the nature of fame, to shine brilliantly for a moment, then to fade, leaving only faint glimmers behind. Still, even faint glimmers can endure. In the broken marquee with its single glowing bulb, there is a kind of defiance, a refusal to vanish entirely. Carole's story, though overshadowed, continues to echo, especially for those who seek out the lives of the forgotten, who remember that behind every glittering name was a human heart, fragile and longing. Her life, her struggles, her end, all remain part of the larger tapestry of Hollywood's history, a reminder of the costs hidden behind glamour. The broken marquee flickers still, its faint light swaying in the night air, and from that fragile glow arises another sound, the steady wash of waves against the Pacific shore, eternal, unchanging, carrying us into the closing meditation of her life, where the sea holds memory even when the world forgets. The waves wash steadily against the Pacific shore, their rhythm unchanged, eternal, unconcerned with the comings and goings of stars or the fleeting stories of newspapers. On the coast where Carole Landis had spent her last days, the sea carried on with its endless song, as though reminding the world that memory, like water, can erode even the hardest stones, yet also preserve echoes in its depths. The ocean had been her neighbor, the horizon her constant view, and now it seemed to guard her story, holding it quietly while the world above rushed forward. In those waves one might hear fragments of her life, the laughter of soldiers overseas, the applause of audiences in theaters, the clinking of glasses at Hollywood gatherings, the whispers in dressing rooms, the tapping of typewriters spinning stories both kind and cruel. The sea gathers all sounds, carries them outward, lets them drift until they mingle with silence. And yet, as the tide returns, so too does memory return, bringing with it the image of a woman whose name may have faded from marquees, but whose presence lingers still, fragile, but enduring. Carole's legacy is not an easy one to define. To some, she remains the golden-haired starlet, remembered only for her beauty, for her role in 1,000,000 BC, for the pin-up photographs that brightened wartime barracks. To others, she is the tragic figure, the woman undone by love and neglect, whose life ended too soon in sorrow. But to those who look closer, who trace the details of her journey, she is more than either of these simplifications. She is the young girl from Fairchild who dreamed beyond her limits, the daughter who bore the weight of her father's absence, the restless spirit who would not settle for obscurity, the woman who gave her light freely even when her own heart was breaking. The Pacific waves remind us that memory is layered. On the surface are the stories most often told, the scandal, the tragedy. Beneath are the deeper truths, less often spoken, waiting for those willing to dive. Carole was not simply a victim of Hollywood's cruelty, though it surely shaped her fate. Nor was she only the reckless lover portrayed in gossip columns, though her romances were real and tumultuous. She was a seeker, always searching, for applause, for recognition, for permanence, for love. In this, she was profoundly human, no different from those who admired her, except that her life unfolded beneath a merciless, public gaze. The Pacific shore holds this memory as it holds all things, its waves forever circling, forever returning. And from the sound of those waves arises the faint rustle of a curtain lifting once more. Not on a stage this time, but in the theater of memory, where forgotten stars are called back into the light. It is here, in this final act, that Carole Landis steps forward again, not to dazzle, not to perform, but simply to be remembered with gentleness. The curtain lifts in memory, not on a stage filled with actors or scenery, but upon a quiet space where shadows mingle with light, where time itself seems to pause. Into this space steps Carole Landis, not as the ping girl of the posters, not as the prehistoric beauty of 1,000,000 BC, not as the tragic name whispered in newspapers, but as herself, fragile, luminous, human. She comes not to dazzle with performance, but to remind us that every life, even when shrouded in scandal or tragedy, contains its moments of grace, of tenderness, of longing that binds it forever to our own. Her story, when stretched across the years, reads like both flame and shadow. She was a flame in her ambition, burning brightly with determination to be seen, to be known, to escape obscurity. That flame carried her from the snowy winters of Fairchild to the glittering lights of Hollywood, from the small stages of San Bernardino to the distant tents of soldiers in faraway lands. Wherever she went, she carried her warmth, her laughter, her light. But she was also shadow, marked by loneliness, by disappointments, by the silence of locked doors and the emptiness of fading applause. The shadow followed her as faithfully as the flame drove her, and together they shaped the arc of her life. To listen to her story is to feel both admiration and sorrow. Admiration for the courage she showed, for the risks she took, for the generosity she gave. Sorrow for the wounds she carried, for the betrayals she endured, for the way her world celebrated her beauty but overlooked her depth. In the tension between flame and shadow lies the truth of her life, a truth not easily reduced to headlines or rumors. She was not only a starlet nor only a tragedy. She was a woman who sought what all humans seek: love, belonging, meaning. The curtain that lifts now is not for applause, but for remembrance. It asks us to hold her memory gently, to see beyond the images crafted by studios and the words printed by typewriters. It asks us to imagine her laughter in quiet rooms, her handwritten notes folded with care, her eyes searching for tenderness in faces that too often turned away. It asks us to honor not only the brightness she gave, but also the vulnerability she could not conceal. Hollywood may have moved on, its machinery indifferent, its lights ever chasing the next name, but memory has its own rhythm, slower, more enduring. Carole's films remain, her photographs endure, her story resurfaces again and again, drawing those who wish to understand not only her fate, but the nature of fame itself. Through her, we glimpse the fragility of those who are asked to shine endlessly for others while hiding their own shadows. Through her, we are reminded that glamour is not armor, that beauty does not shield against sorrow, that applause cannot fill the silence of an empty room. And yet, even with this sorrow, there is beauty in her legacy, for Carole Landis, though gone too soon, continues to stir compassion, to awaken reflection, to remind us of the tenderness owed to every life. Her presence lingers like a faint fragrance in the air, like the shimmer of a star, seen only in the corner of one's vision. Forgotten, perhaps, by the many, but never entirely lost, for as long as there are those who ask her story, as long as there are those who look at her face in photographs and wonder, her light endures. The curtain falls slowly now, not with thunderous applause, but with the soft hush of waves against the Pacific shore. Her life has been told, her flame and shadow traced across time. And as we let the story settle, we are left with an image: the sea at dusk, the horizon glowing faintly, the memory of a woman who once dreamed of being seen, who gave herself bravely to the world, and who now rests in the silence she could not find in life. The waves continue, eternal, carrying her memory outward so that somewhere, someone in listening to her story will remember her again.